Probably the most interesting thing is that for the past, I think, at least 30 years, sex discrimination has been in the form of guidelines, which are not regulations. Now they are moving those into regulations, which means I kind of use the analogy of a should versus shall. So guidelines were just that. They were something that people should follow. Regulations they shall follow. So the regulations have some real differences in them. Probably the biggest one, though, is for transgender employees. And I think the pushback that we might see from the corporate community is that transgender employees now can use the restroom with which they feel most comfortable or with which they identify, which is understandable, but how will it affect other females or males when they see someone that's perhaps dressed differently than they are in a restroom? So that could probably have some pretty far-reaching consequences. Everybody, in the compliance officers as well, call it job posting and say that that's the requirement, and it is not. It's job listing, and there is a big difference between listing your jobs and posting your jobs. Listing your jobs requires that you give priority protected veteran referrals by getting that job to the local Veterans Employment Representative. Posting your job is posting it on the job board. That is not a requirement. It's a nice to have. The listing is the need to have. And the biggest difference that I think people don't realize is that if you post the job, you have to ensure that a veteran is getting at least a 24-hour preview of the job before a non-veteran job seeker. And I think the understanding of the listing versus posting issue doesn't go deep enough. And so every day, probably 3 or 4 times a day, I get phone calls from members and non-members actually asking me to help with the state, because the states even don't understand. So it's just a real confusing issue, and that's probably the best part of my job, is helping people understand that and getting members assistance in their OFCCP audits, and we haven't lost yet. So.